One morning in the month of May of 1871, Paul Domeny received a letter. It was signed by his fellow Arthur Rimbaud, the young prodigy of French poetry. Domeny didn't know it at the time, but this letter was destined to become one of the most remarkable documents in French literary history. Indeed, he quickly realized the letter contained a lot more than poetry. It contained a powerful vision of the future, which culminated in this formula which must have hit Domeny like a lightning strike. Je est un autre. I is someone else. This letter holds special significance for Deleuze, who alludes to it on several occasions, most remarkably perhaps in the preface to Kant's Critical Philosophy, and in his book on Foucault. In this letter, he sees a rare convergence of poetry and philosophy, a moment where reflexive thought and visionary insight fused together. According to him, this unusual convergence expressed the passage between two eras. On the one hand, the humanist legacy of Kant, who replaced God with man at the center of the universe, and who thus made finitude rather than the infinite the fundamental principle of thought. And on the other hand, the forces of the future, already stirring in Nietzsche's concept of the overman. Rimbaud, who was just 16 years old at the time, seemed to have perceived this transformation with surprising clarity. And even though they are expressed in poetic form, they correspond, according to Deleuze, quite exactly to what Foucault later diagnosed about us, moderns, when he said, "Man is an invention of recent date, and one perhaps nearing its end." This strange convergence between Rimbaud's visionary poetry, Nietzsche's philosophy, and Foucault's historical diagnosis convinced Deleuze that something vital is being revealed here in Rimbaud's letter, not just what we are as human beings, but what we are becoming. So in this video, I'd like to explore how Deleuze interprets Rimbaud's vision, what this vision says about us and about our future. It will also serve as an example of how poetry can, just like logic, contribute quite directly to the exercise of philosophy through its visionary power. Creating and dealing with abstract ideas is not so much an innate ability than a skill that you can train. Developing scientific intuition is crucial not just for scientific disciplines, but also for philosophy and everyday life. And that's exactly what today's sponsor, Brilliant, helps you to do. Brilliant offers hands-on courses in science, math, AI, data analysis, and many other disciplines, helping you grasp the mechanics behind everything from simple programs to advanced technology. Instead of memorization, Brilliant's approach is all about practical problem solving, learning by doing, and truly understanding concepts through quite impressive visual means. Plus, since their lessons are designed to fit into a busy schedule, you can learn in just a few minutes a day, right from your phone or computer. Regularity is key to learning. If you want to build a deeper, more intuitive grasp of science, technology, and math, you can try Brilliant for free for a full 30 days at brilliant.org/DeleuzePhilosophy. And if you love it and want to continue, you'll get 20% off an annual premium subscription. Thank you very much to Brilliant for sponsoring this video. In the preface to the English translation of Kant's Critical Philosophy, Deleuze shows how Rimbaud's phrase, "I is another," resonates with Kant's theory of subjectivity. One of the key points of Kant's philosophy is that the self is split by time. The ego, on the one hand, is passive and ever-changing, experiencing the flow of time, while the I is active, constantly synthesizing that flow into past, present, and future. The subject is therefore never fully unified. On the one hand, the ego creates memories around a passive subject, while the I seeks occasions to actualize this memory, make use of it. Unlike Descartes' notion of a self-assured thinking subject in the present, Kant reveals a more complex picture in which the I is an unknown force that affects the ego like another. Rimbaud's expression, "I is someone else," captures this critical view, according to Deleuze, that time itself is the form that fractures us from within. We are stitched together by time in the experience that we make, but we're also endlessly divided by it, caught in a ceaseless oscillation that defines our inner life as both identical to ourselves but also divided from within. It is in this sense that human finiteness, finitude, as opposed to God's infinity, becomes constitutive. However, the visionary power that is of interest to Deleuze comes from another set of remarks in the letter. Remarks which appear to detail the effects of this constitutive finitude, and give it a concrete aspect. Consider the following quote by Rimbaud. "The poet is truly the thief of fire. He is responsible for humanity, even for the animals. He will have to have his own inventions smelt, felt, and heard. If what he brings back from down there has form, if it is formless, he gives formlessness. A language must be found." These three forms, these three concepts, the animals, the formless, and language, constitute, according to Deleuze, the three forces of finitude identified by Foucault, which he calls life, work, and language. Deleuze likely refers to quotes like the following from Foucault's book The Order of Things. "The new positivity of the sciences of life, language, and economics is in correspondence with the founding of a transcendental philosophy. Labor, life, and language appear as so many transcendentals which make possible the objective knowledge of living beings, of the laws of production, and of the forms of language. These forces are the forces of finitude. They are the forces that compose what we usually define as the human form, and which, according to Foucault, was created largely by Kant at the end of the 18th century. But what was not yet grasped at the time of Kant is that the human form, being composed of these forces, cannot be an essence anymore, but rather it has to be conceptualized in a different manner, as a composite of forces, precisely the forces of finitude. The classics before Kant could not anticipate what philosophers after Kant began to see, namely that if these forces change, then the form they produce is bound to change as well. This is what Foucault means by the end of man, which has been quite misunderstood. What Foucault says is not that humanity will disappear in a giant explosion, but rather that the forces that compose the human form will change, such that we will not define ourselves in the same way we did in the past. So for instance, the closing of Foucault's book goes like this. As the archaeology of our thought easily shows, man is an invention of recent date, and one perhaps nearing its end. If those arrangements were to disappear as they appeared, if some event of which we can at the moment do no more than sense the possibility, without knowing either what its form will be or what it promises, were to cause them to crumble, as the ground of classical thought did at the end of the 18th century, then one can certainly wager that man would be erased like a face drawn in the sand at the edge of the sea. So as Deleuze says, this is nothing to weep about. It's not a sad thing. But it also announces the future, and in order to understand what the form man is bound to become, as the forces that compose it are changing, we can ask with Foucault, what did it replace? Where did the forces that compose man come from? Perhaps that can help us understand how they will transform. So we will discuss it in our next section. Foucault's archaeology of knowledge is meant to show, among other things, the transition between two historical eras, two epistemes, as he calls them, because they define two manners in which we get to know ourselves. As we have mentioned, the classical age, the 17th century, which was dominated by forces of infinity, and then the 19th century, marked by the forces of finitude. This transition fundamentally changed knowledge of ourselves and of the world, because it changed what we define as knowledge. In the 17th century, classical thought was characterized by what Deleuze calls forces of elevation to the infinite. He says, in the classical age, all the forces of man are referred back to a force of representation that claims to isolate the positive elements, those that can be raised to infinity, such that the set of forces makes up God and not man, while man can emerge only between categories of infinity. This is why Merleau-Ponty defined classical thought by the innocent way in which it conceived of infinity. Not only did infinity predate finity, but the qualities of man, once raised to infinity, served to make up the unfathomable unity of God. So the classical age was the age of representation, defined in terms of an infinite unity, that of God, which produced several types of infinite. For example, the infinitely large and the infinitely small, following one of Pascal's famous quotes. Not only was this how we conceived of ourselves, but it also defined knowledge in general. Classical thought organized all the sciences into tables, series, and continuums that could be extended at will, and knowledge was structured inside these deployable tables. There are three domains in particular that illustrate this: natural history, analysis of wealth, and grammar. These domains would anticipate the forces identified by Foucault as life, work, and language. This is why Deleuze says, there is no biology in the 17th century, but there is a natural history that does not form a system without organizing itself in series. There is no political economy, but there is an analysis of wealth, no philology or linguistics, but a general grammar. According to Foucault, the 19th century witnessed a profound shift, the encounter with the forces of finitude or finiteness, which transformed all these disciplines in the ones that we are familiar with today, namely biology, political economy, and linguistics or philology. How did these forces change the infinitist perspective of the classical age? This is where the discussion becomes quite fascinating and quite technical. First, Deleuze explains, the concept of life replaced natural history with biology. Instead of arranging living beings in a continuous, potentially infinite series, the discipline now called biology discovered life as a finite force that operates through discontinuous plans of organization, but also differentiation rather than seriation and the finitude of vital force. So biology replaced natural history precisely because it recognized the finite differentiating force of life. Political economy, for its part, replaced the analysis of wealth in the domain of work. Political economy emerged when abstract labor was discovered as an irreducible unit of measurement, but also when work was no longer characterized by specific qualities, for example, what it produces, but became abstract labor power. Production was now understood through the finite force of labor rather than through indefinitely increasing wealth, such that work represented a fundamentally finite human capacity. As Karl Marx observed, Adam Smith's discovery of labor as the measure of all production marked a decisive break with earlier economic thought. Labor became a finite but irreducible power, one that constitutes individuals and societies. Finally, in language, philology replaced general grammar by discovering the finitude of languages scattered across history, in particular the importance of flexions rather than roots. Languages were now understood as finite historical formations rather than variations of universal patterns. This meant that language was seen as an irreducible dispersal of languages from a common origin, Indo-European, rather than variations of a universal structure. Whereas classical thought sought universal roots that transcend particular languages, 19th century linguistics confronted the finitude and historical contingency of language defined as individual systems. This is where Seer emerged. With these three evolutions, the structure of knowledge completely changed. As Deleuze says, everywhere comparisons replaced the general fact that was so dear to the 17th century: comparative anatomy, comparative philology, comparative economy. The forces within man fall or fold back on this new dimension of in-depth finitude, which then becomes the finitude of man himself. A crucial insight in Foucault's analysis, according to Deleuze, is that this encounter with finitude that occurred in the 19th century had two moments. First, man encounters these forces of finitude outside of himself, in the history of languages, in biological evolution, in economic production. But secondly, man appropriated this finitude and recognized it as his own, something within himself. This change of structure also reflected a change in method, namely the passage from the method of analysis of the classical age to the synthesis of Kantian and post-Kantian critical philosophy. As Deleuze says in Kant's critical philosophy, dogmatism affirms a harmony between subject and object and invokes God, possessing infinite faculties, in order to guarantee this harmony. The first two critiques replace this with the idea of a necessary submission of the object to the finite subject, to us, the legislators, in our very finitude. Even the moral law is the fact of a finite reason. Such is the Copernican revolution. This is how the essence of man becomes a force, by undergoing this triple evolution following the forces of finitude. It is in this sense that Foucault can proclaim the death of man, that is, of the classical essentialist position. As Deleuze says, in this new historical formation of the 19th century, it is indeed man who is made up from the set of composing forces drawn from the lottery. Indeed, the relation between composing forces and the outside continually changes the compound form in other relations, as it is taken up and transformed by new compositions. We must take quite literally the idea that man is a face drawn in the sand between two tides. He is a composition appearing only between two others. A classical part that never knew him, and a future that will no longer know him. But if the age of humanism is over, then what is going to replace it? This is where Rimbaud's vision becomes central, as it reveals, according to Deleuze, where the triple forces of finitude are leading us, and that matches, as it happens, Nietzsche's concept of the Superman. In the annex to his text on Foucault, Deleuze says the following: "What is the Superman? It is the formal compound of the forces within man and these new forces. It is the form that results from a new relation between forces. Man tends to free life, labor, and language within himself. The Superman, in accordance with Rimbaud's formula, is the man who is even in charge of the animals, a code that can capture fragments from other codes, as in the new schemata of lateral and retrograde. It is man in charge of the very rocks, or inorganic matter, the domain of silicon. It is man in charge of the being of language, that formless, mute, unsignifying region where language can find its freedom, even from whatever it has to say. As Foucault would say, the Superman is much less than the disappearance of living men, and much more than a change of concept. It is the advent of a new form that is neither God nor man, and which, it is hoped, will not prove worse than its two previous forms. Animals, rocks, and language are the forces of the future that the split subject recomposes itself with, and thus becomes the Superman." This is where we can discuss Rimbaud's vision in more details. To be charged with the animals themselves, Deleuze explains, suggests a new relationship with life itself. What Rimbaud intuitively grasped corresponds to what Foucault would identify as the being of life, a fundamental relationship with life that transcends fixed biological organization. For example, the genetic code is not the strict determination of the form of a species, but rather the passage of genes, and the particular individuals who form the species are the effect of what happens in the wake of this passage. Fragments of code can jump from one species to another through viruses that can transport genetic material between species or through convergences. This is one of the bases of the famous example of the wasp and the orchid that Deleuze and Guattari developed in 1,000 Plateaus. But the point is that the overman is the entity which doesn't simply organize life, but becomes an integral participant in life's transformative power, charged with animals themselves in the most literal sense. Rimbaud's second declaration describes the future human as charged with the formless. Deleuze takes this cryptic phrase as pointing towards an embrace of the inorganic, the mineral, the realm of silicon in particular. If the first transformation concerned the being of life, the second transformation involves the being of work and labor. It manifests itself today in what Deleuze, following William Burroughs, called third-generation machines, cybernetic and information machines. The Silicon Revolution represents a strange revenge, Deleuze says, against carbon-based organic life. While life chose carbon as its fundamental element, our own technological evolution has moved towards silicon-based computing that extends human capabilities way beyond organic limitations, in particular in terms of memory. The forces of labor are thus transformed from disciplinary production to systems of control. The overman becomes charged with the rocks themselves by developing this relationship with inorganic matter, this silicon-based life, which controls by programming systems whose nature is to open up networks of information. For instance, Deleuze says, is it not commonplace nowadays to say that the forces of man have already entered into a relation with the forces of information technology and their third-generation machines, which together create something other than man, indivisible man-machine systems? Is this a union with silicon instead of carbon? Rimbaud's third declaration, finally, concerns language. More exactly, finding a language. This is not merely about inventing new words, but about encountering language in its raw state, what Foucault would call the being of language. Modern literature, according to Foucault, attempts to reach this dimension where language is not merely a means of representation, but rather a force in itself. Writers like Carroll, Joyce, Artaud, Céline, Burroughs, or Rimbaud push language towards what Deleuze calls its agrammatical limit, the point where conventional meaning breaks down and language reveals its own materiality and force. Literature becomes the site where language folds back on itself, reaching towards its own outside. The overman in this dimension doesn't merely use language as a tool, but enters into a transformative relationship with language itself, finding a new universal language that operates directly from soul to soul, as Rimbaud put it, in a kind of communication that does not require any intermediary anymore in forms of words or letters, which appears to be immediately relating one point of the network with another. So an outline of the Superman is taking shape perhaps, and it seems to have two heads. On the one hand, it could become this strange entity that is both recluse but also completely exposed, imprisoned in a cell of its own making, a prison of glass perhaps, that makes it a display to the outside world, as if we were reduced to the avatars that we have online. But it could also become something else, whose power of perception increases and expands, seeing the infinite in all things from its finite perspective. Deleuze seems to allude to this in his combinatory logic, but perhaps it's better to conclude Rimbaud's vision with another vision of his, which Deleuze doesn't mention, but which evokes the future in the most positive sense. In a poem called Sensation, Rimbaud says this: "On the blue summer evenings, I shall go down the pass, getting pricked by the corn, crushing the short grass. In a dream I shall feel its coolness on my feet. I shall let the wind bathe my bare head. I shall not speak, I shall think about nothing, but endless love will mount in my soul. And I shall travel far, very far, like a gypsy, through the countryside, as happy as if I were with a woman." Well, I hope this video was helpful to you to grasp a bit of Rimbaud's wonderful visions and their possible relation with philosophy. But for now, I'd like to address a heartfelt thank you to all my wonderful patrons for their undying support. Thank you also to my wonderful viewers. I'm very touched by your comments every time, and by the privilege of being able to share small bits of this great philosophy with you. So for now, thank you all for watching, and see you soon.